Oh.
Still.
Yeah, I had previous working,
What feels wrong?
I'll eat all of it.
I'm raising the hands or?
Oh, right away.
Okay.
Although I don't know,
So-
it feels like I should have had to change
Are
something
we
else.
supposed to, okay, so what else might be attached to the previous? So when do we know,
Like how I'm adding.
do we just make it? Well, not there, it's not something that to add on to the signature before we start.
This works.
But when you're on first
Well,
line, right, when you're
I
on the
mean,
first
we've
line.
got it set up right
Yeah,
now.
and you go all the way through. It's
Right.
work.
So if you're at the first line, what would we expect to happen?
You
when
could
go back?
technically use the same function and like change the logic. I think they'll probably
So
actually make it more
that one.
complex than it would help. So I would just say make it separate from that. So it's just easier that way.
No? Uh-huh.
Oh,
Slash.
okay.
Yeah, so slash.
Right, because we know that less than zero is an index that's not inside of our range.
Just wanted to reference here.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you got it. No quotes.
So now, the thing you wanna do, go around and around. So how do we yes, you should. Okay. Okay, go ahead and run that again.
It's something you get more and more used to, that syntax, or just like ID class element, like you get into it. It's just like, it's almost just like drilling, just constant.
Okay, interesting, so it's not.
Yeah, that's the
top, so you're not gonna be like more unique. So we know whether we get to the end. So let's go back to.
So it's working, but it's not working if I start. If I start.
What's the previous
I go back to that.
Okay.
So bonus, get it the same thing.
So you're saying the correct index is less.
Less than zero. That's sort of fine.
Yeah, so if you think about it, it's, if you're, basically what your question you're asking is, am I at the very first position? You're right. If I am, then I wanna go to the very last position.
So.
Well, I guess so now, the only thing
Oh, yeah,
left,
me too.
right?
Minus one.
Try that.
We'll go back down. So look at your next one, right? So you actually have to change it, just did not say we did it in the show next. So 957.
Oh.
You actually have to set the issue, like, so you're getting the variable fine, right? And you're actually putting in that page. Everything you're doing is only taking place.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay. I think it might be, that last one.
So,
I think it may be
right,
this
so
one.
you want to
Just
click
click
on
on the next
because
because
zero is the first
Oh,
line, right? So, let's pretend if I'm on the second.
very, it's very close to me. Okay? So, a couple things. The first
So
thing,
now I'm gonna hit
the
the previous button.
when we want to make a check, first, when we're doing conditional, we want to ask a question, we need to not use a single equals, use a single equal sign means to sign.
And now is zero still
So
valid?
that's the first thing. However, the other
Option
thing is zero is
So
in our
now
left,
we're gonna go.
because that's the first thing.
Page.
We don't want to check to see if it's equal to zero.
So now it's
It's not
zero.
what we want to check.
Yeah.
What index is smaller than zero?
The word works.
So when it's less than zero, when we want value to
It only checks to see if it's equal to zero.
One is the last, so that neither button. So what's the last one?
They both work, and then go forward, and they all move back to zero.
Yeah.
The rest has
So
to
you
do
don't need
with
to, because negative one is less than zero.
Okay, so like minus
So
one.
it's
We could do that, so that would work, and that only works because you're subtracting exactly one. So if it's not.
Here, do me a favor, go line 50.
Exactly, yeah, this is less than zero. It's
And
like
I call it out to verify.
Yeah.
So
Okay,
see,
but-
see what's taking place,
Yeah.
right? Something, if something is,
So-
if you're thinking something is off with that variable, like, make sure you get it in the console, so you say, okay, confirm your suspicion. Or say, no, maybe it's.
That works, and boom, nice.
Just like, fuck. Yeah, they got it.
All right, so I'll just go ahead and quickly show the solution here. So, most of you probably copied and pasted this whole function and then just made some small modifications, right? And that's totally cool. That's what I would have done too. That's the smart and efficient thing to do. We don't type what we don't have to, right? So the first thing we need to do is listen to that previous button's click event, just like we did for the next button. And when it happens, we're going to show the previous image. Okay. Then to define that, oh, yeah, image. Thank you. Then we're going to define that function down here. We'll start with this as our sort of boilerplate, our jumping off point here. Well, if we're going to the next image, we know we want to increment, we want to add 1 to that index. So if we're going to the previous index, if we're, say, at index 2, right, we want to go to index 1, we want to subtract 1, decrement, right? We want to subtract 1 from that index that we're using to keep track. All right, so this is almost there. The only thing that differs is when we're subtracting from our index, we're no longer concerned as to if that index is too big, right? Because we're making it smaller. So we don't care now if it's too big. What we're really trying to see is, have we gone before the beginning of our array, right? So as we're going down, say we're at 3, we go to the previous one, we're at 2, that's all good, that's in our array. Go to the previous one, that's 1, we know that's in our array. We go to the previous one, that's 0, we're all good, that's the first thing in our array, that's where we started. We go one more, and all of a sudden we're at -1, and there's no -1 thing in our array, right? We start at 0. And so what we're checking for here is not, is it too big? Is it outside on, say the right side, right? We're seeing, is it outside on the low side, on the beginning side? And so here what we should be checking is not, is it greater than the last index, but instead we should say, is it less than the first index? Okay? And the first index is always 0. So if we've gone outside of the bounds of our array on the beginning side, on the low side, then what do? Well, we don't want to go back to 0. That's where we just were. Where should we go? Yeah, we should go to the last index. Exactly. We should go to the last index, which we know is 8, and we could put 8 here. That would be fine, because that's 1 minus the number of planets, 9. So that's 8. But a more robust way to do that, right? A way that we know will work, even if they discover a planet 10, right? Is we can just do length minus 1. Because length minus 1 is always going to be the last index if there are 9 planets or if there are 9,000 planets. Okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and save that, and I'll let you take a second to soak it in. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and open it in browser. And now we're at 0, right? So when I hit this, it's going to subtract 1. It's going to notice that that index is less than 0. It's because it's now -1. And it's going to say, nope, can't do that. Go back to the end. And there it is, Planet 9. And so now, last time we hid those buttons. That's one strategy we could take. The other way we could make this work is by just infinitely looping through the images, right? Cool. Are there any questions about this? All right, so we're going to keep using those skills in the remainder of tonight. So don't worry about it. If you're still feeling a little shaky, we're going to practice more. But I think, I hope you see like how you can start to use these things in your projects. Okay, so on to bigger and better things. Okay, so tonight, the new content we're going to talk about is forms. Right? And so we talked about forms. We've used them in a couple of things. We used them to collect, the temperature from the user and convert that from Celsius to Fahrenheit, and then to change the background. So we've used forms for a few things, for a few simple things, but without ever covering them in too much depth. So let's talk about them in a little more depth, and we'll use them in our project, okay? So here's an example of a form, right? This is on the General Assembly website, and this is an application form, right? So you want to put your name, your email address, your phone number, and you can even select from this select drop down. You can select some, in this case, it's which course you're interested in, or maybe what city. And then at the bottom here, there's a button to submit, or a submit button, we might call, in a form. So this is a very basic form that we might see on a website. So there are two basic things that forms can be used for. Okay. Two general categories of forms, we'll say. The first is, this is one place where your website can communicate with the back end. Okay. So far, everything we've learned is front-end development. That's what this class is all about. But at some point, if you really, if you continue doing front-end development, at some point you're going to have to communicate with the back end. Right? So even if you're not writing the back end yourself, you're going to have to communicate with the back end and work with the back end developer, say, to do that. And forms are one place where that integration between front and back end happens. Okay, so this is kind of the original intent for forms, was to take this user input, say a registration, and communicate it from the browser, from the front end, back to the server, where we would save that information in, say, a database. Okay, and that's what we kind of originally used forms for. The other thing that we might use forms for, and in fact what we've been using them for in this class, is we can also use those forms to collect users' information just to use on the front end. Okay, so we can take the input from a user and use it to change something about our page. Okay? And that's what we've been using forms for, and in fact what many websites use forms for. To take some input and just to change some stuff on the page. Okay, so a little bit more about that first one. We're not going to go into too much detail here because we're FEWD. We're not talking about the back end too much. But just so you're aware, right? This is a form tag. Okay, so this is what we'll be seeing. Whether we're using it for one purpose or the other, we'll see this form tag on our page. Now, if we're using this form to communicate with the back end, we might put some other attributes on here in order to specify how it communicates, okay? And the two most common ones that we'll see when we're communicating with the backend are this action attribute and this method attribute. So the first one, the action attribute, is a relative path, right? Just like we've learned, to where to send that information in the form. So the back end is waiting for that information at some path, right? And this action is telling it, where do I send that information? The method is, the means of communication. And, there's different ways for this form to communicate. And, I just kind of wanted to show this because you're going to see it sometimes in forms. But explaining, what that exactly means is, outside of the scope of front-end development. Okay. So this is what a form might look like when we're using it to communicate with the back end, say. For our forms, we don't need an action and a method because we're using them all just on the page. So let's talk about form fields. Now there are a ton of form fields. We don't have nearly enough time to cover all of them. But we'll cover some of the most useful and the most kind of core form fields. So the first category that we're going to talk about are text fields. So we've seen a basic text field already. We've seen those a number of times in our applications. But there are other kind of more interesting text fields. For instance, one that are specific for passwords or secure information. And one that's specifically for email addresses. There's ones that are for like telephone numbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, we'll also talk about these things called radio buttons, checkboxes, select dropdowns, but know that there are many more than this, especially if we're using modern browsers in HTML5. For instance, one that we won't talk about that exists is there's a date input, right? So we can have a date input in our form that gives the user a calendar. In Chrome, you don't have to do anything. It'll just give them a calendar where they can pick a date. So that's something that exists. All right, so let's talk specifics, and we're going to just go basically down through this list and learn about each of these things in one way or the other. Okay, so here we go. Here's a whoops. I don't know why I did that. Cool. So here's a text field. Okay, so up top here is just a text field. And down below is what it looks like inside of a form, okay? So the text field, as we've seen, uses the input tag. It uses the input tag, and it has several attributes. So at least one, but potentially several attributes that modify that input tag. All right? So this is what it looks like, and let's talk about each of these attributes. Okay, the first one we see on there is the type attribute. So remember those things that we see in HTML where it's name equals, in quotes, value, those are called attributes. So this is the type attribute. And in forms, we use this input tag for a lot of different types of inputs. A lot of different kinds of inputs, not just text. And so we need to tell the browser, what type of input do we want this to be. Now, we don't use this for every type of form input. We do use it for a lot of them. So here we're specifying what kind we want, and we're just using text for this first one. The second one is the name attribute. Now this one we see a lot in forms, okay? So in other parts of our HTML, we might use like an ID to identify an element. In forms, oftentimes we use this name attribute as an identifier, okay? So this is identifying this input with some name, okay? And the reason that we do that is because, for reasons that this form is also used to communicate with the back end, when we do that communication with the back end, it uses this name to identify the field. And so oftentimes, pretty much all the time, we're going to use this name as an identifier within forms instead of something like an ID. You can use it in addition to an ID if you'd like, but we're definitely going to specify this name identifier. Okay, which brings us to the point, what if we don't use an ID? How do we find this thing? Okay, so we've learned about in CSS how we can select things by an ID by using the hash symbol, right? The pound sign, whatever you want to call it. We've learned how to select things using a class by using the dot. But we can actually select something using any attribute, not just the ID and class attribute. We can select something by any attribute, and it looks something like this. So up here at the top, we're saying in CSS, select all of the elements that have a name attribute equal to username. Okay, so the syntax isn't quite as nice as it is for ID and class because those are the most common, but we can actually select by any attribute. And here we're selecting all the things that have a name username. Okay, more often we're going to see it like this. And what this is saying is select all of the input elements that have an attribute name equals username. Okay, so in our example, these would both, in effect, do the same thing, but we more often will see it like this, where we specify the type of tag we're looking for and the attribute we're looking for. Okay, so this input has an attribute named username, and thus it would match this selector, all elements that have a named username. Or it would also match a selector, all input elements that have a named username. And so we could actually style that specific tag by just using its name attribute. Any questions about that? So what do we know about CSS selectors? Well, we also can use CSS selectors, any valid CSS selector, as a selector for jQuery. So in jQuery, if we wanted to get the value of our username input, we could select it by using that same CSS selector. So here we want to find an input that has the attribute name equals username, and we want to get its value, right? Get that user inputted value out of it. So if I enter my username as Jacob Friedman, because I'm not incredibly creative, then when we do this .val, we're going to get out that Jacob Friedman that was entered into that input. So this, remember, is just any CSS selector. And CSS selectors allow us to select by attribute. So if we don't put an ID on these inputs, we can just select them this way. Questions about that? Okay, and then finally, the last attribute that we saw in that input was this placeholder attribute. And this one just says, what text should we show in that box before the user has inputted anything, okay? So oftentimes we'll see it'll be kind of like grayed out on top of the box, and it'll say, you know, username in there, prompting me as a user to enter my username. So as soon as I start typing, the placeholder will go away. And if I erase all I type and I go out, the placeholder will show back up. Okay, so it's just holding the place of that input until I start typing something in there. That's all that is. Not required, but certainly a good user experience. All right, so once again, you know, here's what our text field looks like. It's an input tag with a type text to specify that we have a text input here. We've got a name, username that we're going to use as our identifier for this thing. And we're giving it a placeholder username. Okay, so let's actually go back to our planetarium code that we just had open, okay? So I said we're going to be working in here all night. So if you go in here and we open this in the browser, what you'll notice is I added this little register link in the upper right-hand corner. So if you click that link, it should take us to the register.html page. Right now, nothing going on here. But we're going to make some stuff go on. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do is just add an input where the user can enter their username. Okay, so let's go to the code. And let's find the register.html file. And you'll notice I left a nice little HTML comment here. Form goes here. And that is where we're going to start putting our input elements for our form. So here we've got a form element, right? And it's got an ID registration form. And inside of there is where we're going to put our input elements. So the first thing we want to collect from the user is a username. So I'm going to go ahead and use the input tag. Give it a type attribute equal to text, because we know this is a text input. We just want the user to input text. And we're going to give it a name as an identifier, call it username. And then finally, we're going to give it some placeholder text. And we're just going to call it username. Notice I'm going to capitalize that placeholder text because the user is actually going to see this. Right? The user will actually see the placeholder. This name, the user will never see that. That's just for our purposes. Okay, so we've added our first input to our registration form. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we should now see a username field. Okay, so I'll show the code again. Input, type, text, name, username, placeholder, capitalized username. Or, you could make like a more user-friendly message. We could make this say like enter a username or something of that nature. The placeholder can say whatever we want. Or it can say nothing at all. Okay, let's look at one more thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Is that box that it's created, is that predefined by the browser, or did you style and set it in CSS?
Great question. So we noticed when we looked at this that this box is, not too shabby. Like, it's not great, but it's not too shabby, right? It's a little bigger than we might expect if it didn't have any styles. So yeah, the style sheet for this project actually styled this box a little bit. So I styled it a little bit. The browser, it had it done by default. It would probably be smaller. It would probably be a bit smaller this way and that way. The font might be a little bit smaller. But these are just HTML elements. We can style them using CSS just like we would anything else, for the most part, within some reason. Yep. Everybody good with this? Because we're going to look at the next part of this. Okay. So notice also that we've got a new register.js JavaScript file. So let's open that guy up. All right. So notice up top here we've got a list of requirements. We're not going to do them all now. We're going to kind of do them one by one, or we're going to set them up one by one, and then at the end you guys will implement them all yourselves. But what we've got here is a list of requirements. The first one is the user must provide a username. Okay? Sounds good. So if we look at the code, what we have so far is we found our form element, right? We're finding the element with the ID registration form, which is our form element. And we're listening for the submit event. Okay? So we're waiting for that form to be submitted. And when that is, we want to run some function called process form. All right? And I just defined this function down here, process form. And remember, I've done this event prevent default thing because if we don't, it'll refresh the page. And now I can explain the reason that happens is because the default behavior of a form is to communicate with a backend server, right? So that's the default behavior, is to communicate with some backend code. And it does that by submitting the form and refreshing the page. Okay? But we're not using it for that. So we're going to prevent that default behavior so that we can use it for our own purposes. Okay? So here, we're not going to do everything here, but we're going to just get the entered value out of that form. Okay, so we're going to get the username that the user entered out of that form. So I'm going to create a variable called username. And I'm going to give that variable the value of the username input. Now, we're going to find that username input by finding an input tag that has a name attribute username. Okay, so we just saw how to do that. Well, we want an input tag, all good, but we don't want just any input tag, right? we only want the input tag that has a name attribute equal to username. Oops, I missed a thing. Okay, so this is just like we always do, and we're just finding an element here. Just the way that we're finding it is a little more interesting now because we're finding it by an attribute. Okay, and once we found that element, what we want to do is get the user inputted value out of that attribute, right? We want to get the user inputted value out of that attribute, and we do that in jQuery by doing .val, open and close parentheses. So now, when this form is submitted, it's going to run this process event form, and the first thing we're going to do is just see what username was inputted by the user and put it in this variable here, username. Okay, we're pushing up on 8:30, so let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to flesh out the rest of this registration form and create a full registration form that we could use in real application.
Sorry.
I was in the wrong but I was
Is that all you need?
Yeah.
You don't need it. Yeah, just check your console. And you're ready. Get a solution. You're fine.
Use my own solution.
Yes, well, in a kind of weird way, yes. So the background is, so you would actually have multiple backgrounds. So what you actually do is, so when you have the two backgrounds, they actually stack on top of each other. So what you do is, class 1 or 2, you talked about how you to specify, it's basically 4 things you have to say. Like, if you would have said like, it would be like 255 times 255. The last value is the opacity level. So what you can do is create a white overlay on top of it that's like semi-transparent, like about 5 or something like that. And that would kind of give you that effect.
So right to like, and then it would insert it.
So it would basically look like this.
Yes.
For me, not this.
Oh, yeah, totally.
I was really hoping we were gonna go over the calendar function.
Well, it's actually pretty easy, honestly.
really?
I mean, the browser takes care of all of it for you. So all you have to do is input type date, and it'll give you a calendar.
Really?
Yeah. So the harder part is translating, the input into something that you can use.
Something you can use?
Yeah.
Let me figure it out.
Are you cool?
So you're not really styling it.
I know some people are wearing
like
like
a layer on top of it. You have that kind of like washes it out. That's what it is.
Nice. I don't know.
You can, but it gets a little kludgy. I mean, the other alternative is just open up the image in Photoshop and just kind of like drop the opacity a little, but we can figure out the other way I was trying to explain it.
All right. I want to make sure we get through this, so I'm going to plow ahead. Exactly 5 minutes. Well done. All right, here we go. So far we've covered just the text type of input, which we already kind of knew. So let's get to more interesting stuff. The next one we might do is a password. All right. So this is a password input. It's an input with a type password. Right. So we use the same HTML tag, and instead of using type text, we're just going to use type password. And here I've given it also the name password. Because that's normally what we're going to use the thing we're going to be collecting in here. Maybe we also would use this type of field to collect, say, social security number or some other sensitive information that you don't want showing in plain text. Okay. So really, all this type password gives us is, instead of being text when the user inputs it, the user will see little black dots or, whatever, little dots in the input field instead of the letters that they're entering. And the reason, we do that is so if somebody looking over your shoulder can't see your password and then know how to get into your account. Okay? So this type password just makes it so that the input field is secure, right? Has that sort of dotted obscurity. And if this were our input, the way we would get it is we would look for an input tag, and we look for the one that has the name password. Right? Input tag has the name password, and we would grab the value out of there. Okay, so now we've added the username input. So on your own, add a password input to get the user's password. And then also in the JavaScript, after you get the username value, get the password value. Okay, so how did we do that? Well, we just created another input tag. We gave it a type password instead of a type text. And we gave it a name password because that's what the user is going to be putting there. We could also add a placeholder if we wanted to. And put the placeholder as password. And then in our JavaScript, we just created a variable named password. And in there, we store the value of the input with the name password. So we find that input that has the name password, we get the value out of it, and we store it in the password variable. And so when we look in our browser, I had intended these will be on new lines, but we'll see this password here is holding the place. But once I start typing in there, oh yeah, color's white. Well, good catch. Let's go into our CSS and modify that. So here we've got some styles in our input. We just got to change the color. Let's change it to black. Since this is in the main, we've made the main color white. So that's the inputs that are inside of the main are getting that color. So in order to fix that, we've got to change the color of the inputs to black. And then also, just to make it look a little bit better, I'm going to make sure they're on their own line by making them display block. So inputs are not display block by default. And thus, I'm going to make them display block so they force a new line. So remember, block elements by themselves can't be side by side. So now when I come back here, I refresh, looks better. Type in here, and now I'm going to get these black dots instead of seeing actual input. Cool. All right. Go back to the slides. The next one we might add, and the next one that we will add, is an email input. So again, this looks and feels just like a text input. The difference here, this is a newer kind of input. The difference here is if you're on a phone, a mobile device, it'll present you with a keyboard optimized for entering emails. So what it'll do is it will surface a keyboard that has the @ sign on the front part of the keyboard. You won't have to go digging for the @ sign, right? So similar thing if we made this a type like tel for telephone, right? It would surface the telephone keyboard, right? So the numbers keyboard. So really that's all that this input does is gives on a mobile device the default keyboard being the email keyboard, a keyboard that's good for entering emails. That's really what it does. But, you know, why not do that to make our form a little better? Because we could just use a text input for emails, right? Because an email address is just text. We could totally do that. But if we use the email, we get a better keyboard. So let's go ahead and add this because we also want to collect the user's email on our form. So let's add this and then get the value in our JavaScript. Another thing it might do is it might help Chrome autofill too, if you use the email.
So, good question.
Yeah.
So whenever I come across like a website and filling out a form, and like the right keyword doesn't pop up, that just means they didn't put that in because
Probably, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the email input type is relatively new. It's part of, I believe it's part of HTML5. So if you know the site was made before HTML5 was popular, then you know they probably didn't have that, and that's why a lot of times the keyword isn't exactly right when you're surfing the web. All right. So what we've done here is we've added another input tag to our form, this time using type email. We've given it a name, email address. Could be whatever name we think is appropriate. And I've put a placeholder there, email, to help prompt the user what they should be putting in that box. In my JavaScript, I've just created another variable called email address. And in there, I'm finding the input that has the name, email address, and getting the value outside of there, storing it in that variable. So now when the user submits this form, we're going to have three variables, one for the username, one for the password, one for the email address, excuse me. Everybody good? Questions about this so far? Okay, so now we're done with the text input types. So let's go on to something a little more interesting. And let's talk about radio buttons. Okay, so this is what we mean when we say a radio button. There are different kinds of buttons we might see within a form. This one specifically is radio button, and they're often represented with a circular input type. So when we look at a radio button visually, generally they're circular. And that's the default browser style, is this circular button here. And how radio buttons work are you can select at most one of a list of things, right? So when we see these radio buttons next to each other, we know we can only select one of these things. And if I hit this one would no longer be selected, right? So these circular buttons mean you can select at most one of these things. Those are called radio buttons. So here is what a radio button looks like in HTML. So it's actually a series of input tags. Okay. So far, everything we've looked at has been a single input tag. Radio buttons are multiple input tags. So one for each potential option. Okay. So in the example above, right, we're selecting a country. Okay. And so here our input tags have a type radio, and they're grouped by their name. Okay. So here they all have the same name, country, because they're all part of the same decision, right? So we're deciding here what country. All three of these are part of that same decision, so they have the name country. So they're grouped by this name. Finally, each one has a unique value. Okay, so the value is what value is selected if I hit this last radio button. Well, in this case, it's the country Mexico. All right. So a radio button decision is multiple inputs, one for each potential answer I could give, right? And they're grouped by country. I mean, not by country, by the name. So they're grouped by this name attribute. So when I select one of these, if I select another one, it will be unselected because they have the same name. Okay, so that's what I mean by grouped by. It's part of the same decision. Now I could have multiple sets of radio buttons in a single form. So I could have country and say state, right, as another set of radio buttons. and they wouldn't affect each other. They'd be independent. But here, they all have the same name, so they're all going to be part of the same decision. All right, so does everybody remember a CSS? Was that a question? Okay, sorry. A CSS thing we talked about called pseudo classes. Remember pseudo classes? Can anybody tell me what a pseudo class was? Remind me what a pseudo class was? Anybody remember? It's been a while, I know. So links we often think of as having pseudo classes. So A tags. Sometimes you look like you had, maybe?
You know the exact definition, but you use it to like define what happens when you call it over.
Precisely, right? So we use these pseudo selectors in order to say, like, is a link being hovered over, right? So we can say A:hover to give specific styles for hovering, for that hover state, right? We can use A:visited to give a specific style to links that have been previously visited by this user, okay? There is a pseudo selector for checked. And this means the input with the name, attribute, country that has been checked or selected by the user. Okay. So if we wanted to style separately the one that has actually been selected by the user from the ones that haven't been selected by the user, we could use this pseudo selector checked to get only the one that the user has checked, has selected. Okay, so we're building this big CSS selector now where we're saying we want the inputs, but not every input, just the ones that have the name, country, and not all of those, because remember in the example there are 3 of them. We don't want all 3. We want only the one that is checked by the user. Okay? So we can use that to get the value. So again, this is just a CSS selector. We can use it in jQuery. So we can get the input with the name country that's been checked by the user and get the specific value for that input. So if I were to click Canada as a user, when I submitted my form, if I ran this, I would get this value Canada. Okay, any questions about this? Because we're going to put it into our form. All right, so let's do that. And to know exactly what we're putting in our form, let's take a look at the JavaScript because it gives us, in order, some specifications here. So we've done password, we've done email address, and we also say the user must love space. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a question for them. Do you love space, yes or no? And they have to choose whether they love space or not. So we're actually going to do this one together. So how many options do we have here? 2 options, right? One for yes, one for no. Okay? And they can only choose one at a time because it doesn't make sense to say yes and no, right? And since it doesn't make sense to say both, that's why we're going to use a radio button, because you can only select one at a time. Okay, so I'm going to create an input with a type radio, and I'm going to give it a name, love space. In this first one, I'm going to give you a value of yes. And remember, each button that's a part of the same decision is going to have the same name. So I'm just going to copy that, and then I'm just going to change the value from yes to no. So here we have 2 radio buttons. Only one can be selected at a time. Either they love space or they don't. If they don't, then they're not allowed to sign up. All right. So in our JavaScript, if we want to get the value that the user inputted, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it love space. Or we can call these whatever we want them to, but I'm trying to be pretty obvious here. And in order to select the one that the user has checked, we need to use this new selector that we learned about. So we want to find all of the input elements, but not all of them, only the ones that have the name love space. And not all of those either. We only are interested in the one that they've checked, the one that the user has checked. The only one we're interested in. And we want to get the value of that input. Okay, everybody good? Now what we'll notice though, if you look at this in a browser, well, all we've got are two little buttons here. Okay, so bookmark that. We're going to come back to it. But what you will notice about this is when we do it, only one can be selected. All right. Questions? Okay, let's go back and learn about another type of input. This is kind of the opposite of a radio button, I guess you could say. It's called the checkbox. All right. And the checkbox is a set of buttons that multiple of which could be selected, right? So in radio buttons, you can only select one, at most one. For checkboxes, you could select more than one. So for instance, if I wanted to select all the pets I have, I would say dog and cat. I don't really have a dog and cat. I wish I did. So this is for a decision where there's potentially more than one answer the user could provide. Okay? And just like we did before, we can use this checked pseudo-selector to find the input elements that are checked by the user. The caveat is they could potentially check more than one. And so what we'll get back is a list or an array, right, of those inputs that they have checked. So we could look at each of those things and see what they were, and potentially we might do that sometime in the future. But right now, all we want to do is see how many of them did they input. And remember, because this is an array, right, there's more than one potentially of these things. This is a list. We can say dot length and find out how many did the user check. Did they check 0, 1, 2, 3? Okay, so let's add some of these to our planetarium form. So here I'm going to add, let's find out what they're for. In the register.js file, it says they must love space. The user must also choose their 2 favorite astronauts. Okay, so we're going to give them a list of astronauts they could potentially choose from, and they have to choose at least 2. So let's do that. Let's create some checkbox inputs. I'm going to create an input of type checkbox with a name astronauts. And we're going to give some values of some different astronauts. Like, say,
We should use diagram.
what?
We should use your diagram.
Do you know how to spell it? Like that? Right about that. I'm just really terrible at spelling, so I don't want to embarrass myself. Of course, we can add some Armstrong here. And add Aldrin. Also, I don't know how to spell his name. We can add any other favorite astronauts? Kelly, yeah, Scott Kelly, and his brother, Mark Kelly. Oh, what's the teacher's name? Sally Ride? Is that it? Yeah. Ride. What's the teacher's name? I don't know. Okay, so now we've got a full list of, we probably went a little too much into that, but we've got a full list here of astronauts. Okay? And we're going to require at some point that the user select at least 2 of those. And in our JavaScript, the way that we're going to know how many they selected is by creating a variable. I'm going to call it number of astronauts. And to get the value there, we're going to find inputs, not all the inputs, only the ones that have a name attribute equal to astronaut. Okay, did I make it singular or plural? I have to look. I made it plural. Has a name of astronauts. And not just all of those, only the ones that are checked. And here, we're not so much interested in the value. We just want to know the length. In other words, how many did they check? Because this is going to be a list of all the ones that they checked. And we're just interested in the length of that list. How many are in there? Okay. Anybody need to see that any longer? Okay. Just a reminder, the solution will be posted, so if you're getting behind on the typing, that's okay. Okay, let's talk about, I think there's basically one more big one, and this is the select dropdown, okay? So this is an input that looks like this. We see this a lot. This is a decision that's similar to a radio button, okay? So a radio button, remember, you can choose at most 1. A select, you can also choose at most 1, right? Now, why might you use a select instead of a radio button? Well, for a radio button, you're gonna have to show each of those individual buttons. So for instance, if I really am choosing what state I'm from or live in, right, I have to show, potentially 50 radio buttons, which is a terrible user interface, right? That I have to scroll all the way up and down until I find the one I'm looking for. So instead of putting those in individual radio buttons, I might just shove them into this little select that can be opened and closed. Okay? But it's a similar decision. Now this input is especially interesting because it doesn't use the input tag. All of the ones we've seen so far use the input tag. This one does not. This one uses a select tag. Okay? So this uses the select tag. And notice this select tag has a name just like our other inputs. So it has a name here, and we've called it interests in this case. And then within that, each of those choices, each of the items in that dropdown is an option tag. So each of those are an option that I could potentially choose. And my option has a value. just like our checkboxes in our radios have values. These will also have values. Okay? And then also, we're going to add some text inside of those, and this text is what the user actually sees when they're looking up and down that select. So here, notice I've got a lowercase music as my value, but uppercase music in between, because that's what the user is actually seeing. Okay. So the user never sees this value. They will see this text inside of the option. All right, and so if we want to get the one that they've selected, well, all we have to do for a select is find the select itself. In this case, the select has a name, interest. Should really be interest, I guess, because you can only pick one. But has a name, interest, and we can just do .val right there. And that will give us the selected value. Okay? So not too terribly different than what we've seen so far. All right. So let's go ahead and add a select to our project. And then we'll be almost at the point where our form is complete. So let's look at the JS again to see what we're supposed to be doing here. The user must select a favorite planet. So here we're going to create a select that has options of all the planets. So I'm going to create a select. Oops. Select. And I'm going to give it a name, planet. And inside of that select, I'm going to create options, one for each planet. Now, I'm not going to do them all because I want to save a little time here, but we'd make one called Mercury. And inside of that, we put the text that we actually want the user to see. And we'd make one for Venus. And I'm just going to do one more. We'll make one for Earth. Now, something I want you to notice. Here we're putting all of these in here ahead of time in just HTML. What's another way we could insert these options into this? Yeah, we could do this in JavaScript, right? We could have that same list of planet names that we had to make our carousel. We could use that same array. We can iterate through that array and just create these options and put them in this select. And that way we wouldn't have to type out all this. We could just use our JavaScript to programmatically fill it with things. And this isn't too bad. We've got 9 planets, but imagine if we had, say, 50 states, right? We don't want to type out an option for all 50 states. Just use JavaScript for loop to put those things in there. Okay? All right, so now we've got our select in there. So let's take a look at our JS. So remember, in order to get the value that the user selected, I'm just going to create a variable called planet. And we're going to use jQuery to find a select this time, not an input, because it's a different HTML tag. And yeah, it's the only select on the page, so we could just leave it at this. But that's not the best practice, because what if we have more than one? So let's narrow it down to only selects that have the name planet. And from there, we want to get the val that the user selected. And that will automatically give us the value of the option that the user selected. Okay, so we don't have to do anything extra here. Up here, we had to use that checked pseudo selector to find the exact input. But here, we can just use the select and use .val. Okay. Let's go back to the slides for a second. So a couple more things in order to make this thing complete, okay? We've got all the inputs we want, but in order to make a form complete, we're probably gonna add a couple things. One, we're gonna add an input of type submit, okay? And this is a submit button, all right? So we've seen before a button tag in HTML, and you know, that typically means a button that's not inside of a form. If we're doing a submit button inside of a form, we should instead use an input tag of a type submit, and that's going to give us a button. The value here is just the value that the user sees on the button. So this is a little weird because in other inputs, the value is not seen by the user. It's just for our purposes in JavaScript or whatever. But the submit button is kind of unique in that the user does see the value. That's what shows up on the button. So kind of weird, but we don't really use it for anything. We don't want to ever get the value from this. It's just a tool for the user to say, hey, I'm done, submit this thing. Okay? The other thing we might add, and that we should add, are labels. Okay? So for instance, our radio buttons right now have just little circles, right? They don't say anything. So if we want to give them some meaning, we can use these labels in order to assign things, to show things. So for our input, we would create a label and we would say for the name of the input, and then in there we would give it some text to show. So this for attribute should match the name attribute. Okay? Yes? So you could. I mean, you could, and it could look exactly the same. The reason you do it this way, there's a couple of reasons. One, accessibility. Okay? So if you want your screen reader or some other accessible device to know that the text there is associated with this input, you have to use an input. I mean, you have to use a label and you have to use this for. Okay? So that's the primary reason. Another reason why you might use a label instead of a something else is, you know, if it's a label for like a radio button or something of that nature, when you click the label, it'll actually work for the button as well. So I could click the text here and it would apply to the button as if I clicked the button itself. So there's some small things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and add these to our form. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to add an input of type submit. And I'm going to give it a value register for planetarium. Okay. All right, and to save a little time, I'm not going to actually label all of these things, but how we would do it is like this. Right here before my username input, I could add a label for, and I would put in the name of the input that I want to label. So for username, and inside of here I'm going to say username. Okay, and so now we have a label that's associated with this input. And just do one more. We also do it here for password. Okay. And then if I went to the browser, refresh, well, I'd start seeing those labels show up. The rest of my form is not too glamorous yet, but that's okay. All right, so let's turn back to the JavaScript. Everybody got a couple labels in there? No need to get them all. We just want a couple. We can figure out the rest later. Okay, So here in our JavaScript, so far we've gotten the values of all these things. The next thing we want to do, and we're not going to finish it tonight, so we'll finish at the beginning of next class. But the next thing we want to do is we want to validate that the user has given us good input. Okay? We want to validate that the user has given us good input that we can actually use to register them. So this is a common web application sort of task that we'll do is form validation. Very common. Every form on the internet probably has some sort of validation. Because we don't want to send junk data to our server, for instance. So we want to validate that all that data is okay. So let's just do one together, all right? So let's look at our requirements here. We say the user must provide a username. Okay? User must provide a username. So in order to check for this, first of all, what JavaScript thing do we use to make a check or make a decision? JavaScript flow do we use to make a decision or check something? A conditional, right? An if statement. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to do some kind of conditional. And we want to say if, let me add some space at the bottom of this. And we're going to say if, well, we know the username that the user entered is here. So we're going to say if the username is what? Any guesses? This may not be completely intuitive, but what might be checked here? It's blank. So the value will never be the word username. That's a good guess. But if the user hasn't entered anything, it's not going to be the placeholder. What it's
I mean, just like if they're trying to not actually put out.
Oh, yeah, so we could check that. Like we could check for phony values like, you know, username or password or whatever it might be. We could check for that. But what we're really just checking to see, did they enter anything at all? And in the case that they didn't enter anything at all, the value will be an empty string. Blank, in other words. So we're saying if the username is blank, in other words, they did not enter a username, we want to do something. Okay? And what we're going to do is show the user an error. Okay, so quickly let's peek back at the HTML. Notice we have a div here that has a class hide, an error, and an ID of error message. But there's nothing in it. It's just an empty div that's hanging out there, and it's hidden. So what we're going to do is we're going to find that div by its ID. And we're going to change what's inside of it to an error message. And we're going to be very polite about it. We're going to say, please enter a username. Well, we're almost done, except for that error message is still going to be hidden because it has that hide class on it. And so we're just going to remove class hide in order to remove that hide class and show the error message. Now, as a reminder, when we're doing two jQuery things in a row with the same selector, we can actually chain them together like this. And to just make the formatting a little better, I'm going to put this one on a new line and just indent it. And I could even do the same for this one. So I'm finding the elements with the ID error message. I'm just changing the what's inside of it to say, please enter a username. And then I'm removing the hide class. So if I save this and then go back to the browser, I can refresh. And if I enter this form before putting anything in there, I'll see an error show up. Please enter a username. And all of a sudden, we've started validating our form. And we have all the tools to keep doing it, but we don't have the time. So we're gonna have to put that off until Monday. Yeah, I'll go back to the code for a second. So could we do something to make the submit work? In other, well, you shouldn't have to do anything. It should happen automatically because we're listening to the submit event. So there could be an error in your JavaScript that's causing it not to submit. There could be a typo in your HTML potentially. But we can take a look at it in a second. Everybody good with this? Okay. All right, so we're past that. Couple announcements before we head out. The final project draft of the whole project should be done this Sunday. Okay, so we have one more full week of class, and then the next Monday is presentations. Okay, so there's 3 more classes after tonight. We are terribly close to the end. Okay.
It's getting emotional.
Yes, I'm pretty upset. So in light of this, the fact that the course is coming to the end and final project stuff is coming up, I'm going to actually do extended office hours for the next 2 Sundays by an hour. So this Sunday, I will do office hours from 2 to 5 instead of 3 to 5. And probably the following Sunday, I'm going to probably do 3 to 6, but I will let you know ahead of time. So this, yeah, they tend to stay open enough past. But for this Sunday, 2 to 5. Okay, so and I'll remind everybody in office hours. So if you want to get a little work on your homework or your final project or anything else, come to office hours on Sunday. Also, Paul is having office hours tomorrow night instead of Tuesday. So tomorrow night, and remember to RSVP. I'm sure he'll remind you, but please RSVP for those because he doesn't want to hang out here if nobody's coming. So just RSVP for that if you plan on coming tomorrow, for Paul to also help you.
Yeah, I'll send out a reminder tomorrow.
Cool. And then finally, there's one more homework assignment, assignment 8. This will be the last one. Okay. Don't worry, it's not a terribly difficult one. It's basically doing what we just did, creating a form. Okay. Not the validation part. We're just going to create a form. Here, let's take a look at it together real quick. So this is the, I think it's the relaxer site. Oh, no, I'm forgetting. Yes, this is the relaxer site, the one that we've been working with a lot, right? And all we're going to do is there's a register page within this project, and we're just going to create a registration form in that page. And the technical requirements are pretty loose. We just want you to use a few different of the ones we talked about, and some on this list are ones we haven't talked about. So feel free to, go outside of what we've mentioned in class. We want to make sure you link to this register page from other pages on the site, and style it a little bit. Some, like I did my form, I kind of made it a little bigger and a little wider. So instead of just relying on the default styles for those things, give it a little bit of style, CSS. And then finally, make sure the user's password isn't visible. And we learned how to do that tonight. There's obviously some bonus things because that's fairly simple, based on our learnings tonight, it's fairly simple. There's some bonus things to do if you really want to go for it. One, make sure it's responsive, make sure the form works well on all screen sizes. Like we just did, use jQuery to validate the form and show error messages. And then another thing you could potentially do is, show some success message. So once the form is submitted correctly, show, thank you, your form has been submitted successfully or something along those lines. Okay, so pretty straightforward and not too difficult, I hope, because I want you to have plenty of time to work on your final project as well. Okay, so please do, I know I'm running a little bit late, so my apologies, but please do fill out this exit ticket because, this is how we track to make sure we're providing you a good class. So fill out this exit ticket before you leave. Did somebody post it in Slack already? Cool, thank you guys. And this is class 17. Too close to the end. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if you reverse sort of work, but by using double quotes on the outside,
It would work.
it would look. So it showed up as a question.
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
You're seeing that there.
I did.
It was there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Take a look. Input types and values.
You're not gonna be like, you're
You need this.
You don't actually, that's not bad, but it's not your turn.
all that is.
Yeah, that's it. So I have, sometimes it is required in other languages, like in email, so I have a habit of sometimes. But it's not definitely not required. Either way. So let's look at the concepts and just see if there are any errors. Yeah, me too. So go ahead and hit register. So check it out. So syntax. So take a look at line 26. So where the line that kind of looks like that. So look at your CSS slide. Well, yeah, so my CSS slide should be in the first one. When you're using a square bracket here, what are you using? And check out email address too.
Why would it not? I mean, it shows up. It shows up the same.
Well, because it's
just.
it's all a string, so it's not going to notice the error that's in the string. You won't notice it until you try to use that string. So, yeah, no problem. I mean, comes with practice. It's never going to be too easy.
Monday, 18th is the presentation, right?
Not coming Monday, a week from Monday.
18th.
Yes, 18th. So this Monday coming up, we're going to finish this stuff. Maybe talk about one or two small things, and then we'll talk about where do you go next with FEWD skills, how do you develop more FEWD skills, and we'll also talk a little bit about how do I make a website and get it hosted, those types of things. And then the Wednesday will be just a full 3 hours dedicated to finishing your projects. Okay, so a week from today, full 3 hours to finish projects. Just to work on projects with full access to all of us as you're going. And then the next class Monday is going to be, the presentations.
For a presentation, how involved does it need to be?
Not
It can
in.
be as simple as, hey, look at that.
Yeah, I mean, we'd like you to show it in some depth and maybe talk about how you did it, and some interesting things in there. That's a good point. I'll bring up that a little bit. But there's no strict requirements for the presentation. I don't want to put anybody.
You know, we're gonna have like a big monologue.
You don't need to have like a slide and videos and like high production quality, like none of that necessarily. Yeah. Now, if you do all that, you know, I'll be thoroughly impressed. But yeah.